Hi, I'm Ben and you're watching Batarang to the Butt, and this video is pretty much a complete history of Moon Knight. Part 1. It's going to be a long and complex video, so please do not let it flop. If you could leave a like, that would really help. Thanks. I'm going to be discussing and spoiling a lot of Moon Knight comics. However, I won't be going over every detail, so if any of these intrigue you, please go out and read the comics for yourselves. Support your local comic book store. Moon Knight first appeared in Werewolf by Night issues 32 and 33. Written by Doug Moench and with art by Don Perlin. In this first appearance, we learn that Moon Knight is Mark Spectre, and that Spectre is a soldier of fortune, mercenary, veteran of 3 wars, 5 South American revolutions. He had a brief flirtation with the CIA, and basically he's led a very busy and action-packed life. We also get to see him beating the living snot out of the main character of the book. Seriously, it's pretty much a 2-issue slugfest. Mark has been tasked with taking down the werewolf, and so he does it. Mark brings in the bounty to the mysterious committee, but he soon realises that the werewolf is actually innocent, and so he sets it loose and teams up with him. Overall, it's a pretty dope introduction. Now, you may have noticed that there's no mention of Konshu here, but don't worry, we'll get to him. Moon Knight's popularity led to a string of appearances over the next 5 years, including in Marvel Spotlight issues 28 to 29, The Defenders issue 46 to 51, The Spectacular Spider-Man issues 22 and 23, and Marvel 2-in-1 issue 52. It was around this time that original creator Doug Moench got another chance to write the character in the backups of Hulk magazine. It was in issue 17 in 1979 when we first got to meet Randall Spectre, Mark's troubled brother. Randall is a serial killer, also known as the Hatchet Man, and it turns out that he has been murdering nurses around New York City. In issue 18, Moon Knight confronts his murderous brother in Central Park, and a fight ensues, in which Randall is killed. Or, that's how it seemed anyway. We'll get back to him later. After starting out as a villain, these subsequent appearances helped to set Moon Knight on the path of being a hero. However, readers still only knew him as a moon-themed badass with neat gadgets. The Konshu stuff was finally introduced in Moon Knight's first ever ongoing series, in 1980, which was once again written by Doug Moench and featured art by Bill Sienkiewicz. This is where we finally got his full origin story. As we already knew, Mark was at one point a soldier for hire. This particular mission was just south of the Egyptian border, and it saw Mark working for Raoul Bushman. Now remember him, because he's going to be important. Bushman was not a good dude, and he's not exactly the most subtle villain, seeing as his face is tattooed as a mask of death. This original design for the character always reminds me of this guy from Scooby-Doo. Oh, and also Bushman had steel teeth. Bushman had planned to loot an archaeological dig site, but when he starts to slaughter innocent civilians, Mark tries to overpower him. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and Mark is knocked out and left for dead in the desert. After a while, he comes to and begins to wander, lost in the desert. It is only when he is on the verge of death that he is discovered by the survivors of Bushman's slaughter. However, it is too late. Mark is declared dead. However, his body was laid to rest in front of the gaze of an old Egyptian statue, the hoard of a long-dead king. I think you know where I'm going with this. Mark Spectre is resurrected by Konshu, aka God of the Moon, aka God of Vengeance, Shepherd of the Lost, greatest god of the great gods. He's been given many names over the years. But basically, this was the beginning of a tumultuous relationship between Mark Spectre and Konshu. With this resurrection, Spectre had been given superhuman abilities, such as increased strength, speed, and endurance. He then uses his new heightened abilities to go and fight crime and seek vengeance in Konshu's name. He moves into a mansion on Long Island with old ally Frenchie and new friend Marlene. Mark also creates 3 new personalities to help with his mission. There's Stephen Grant, a Wall Street whiz who helps balance the finances. There's also Jake Lockley, a street-smart cabbie who hears everything. This is the personality that he uses when he wants to stay connected to what's going down in the streets. And then, of course, there's Moon Knight, the badass fist of Konshu. Oh, and did I mention that he has a mooncopter? Because he does, it's cool. After the tussle in the desert, Bushman had narrowly escaped Moon Knight's wrath. However, having re-emerged in New York, Moon Knight was given another chance to finally take him down. In the following battle, Moon Knight almost gets his jugular chomped, but thankfully he is able to overpower Bushman. This first issue concludes with Mark and Marlene realising that Moon Knight can be more than what Bushman created. In order to rise above Bushman, Moon Knight must overcome his own bloodlust and show mercy. And so, Bushman is left for the police to take in. Now, before moving on, I want to discuss one of the laziest descriptions of Moon Knight, in my opinion. People love to refer to him as Marvel's Batman, and while I think that's a massive oversimplification, I think I understand where the comparison comes from. Obviously, they're both rich white guys with gadgets, but I also think that Bill Sienkiewicz's art here is part of the comparison. Sienkiewicz's early work is heavily influenced by Neil Adams, and Neil Adams' most iconic work is on Batman. Sienkiewicz would go on to sharpen his own unique style, but at this stage in his career, yeah, it was very comparable to Adams' work on Batman. Also, this isn't a complaint, I think Sienkiewicz's work on this series is incredible. He did the interior artwork up until issue 30, and he did covers for the entire series. But yeah, his early Moon Knight work is very Batman-y. In issue 3, Spectre encounters Anton Mogart, aka the Midnight Man. A thief who stole for the thrill of it and wore a black costume resembling Moon Knight's own suit. His whole deal is that he commits his crimes at midnight. Midnight Man was then presumed dead after his first encounter with Moon Knight, after he was shot by Marlene and fell off of a roof. It turns out that he survived, but the incident left him horribly disfigured. He returns later in issue 9, as pretty much a husk of his former self, but this time around he's being used as a pawn by Raoul Bushman. What? Yes, that's right, old Bushman had recently escaped from prison. In issue 10, Bushman unsurprisingly betrays Midnight Man, and leaves him and Moon Knight to drown in the flooding sewer system. Thankfully, Moon Knight manages to rescue Midnight Man and escape, but Bushman, of course, gets away again. This failure, accompanied by the destruction of the statue of Konshu, leads Moon Knight to a crisis of faith, even going AWOL for several days. Now, throughout this run, we often see Moon Knight's allies questioning his state of mind. His multiple personalities often put a strain on his relationships with others. However, it's all kind of dealt with when Marlene gives Mark/Steven/Jake/Moon Knight a pep talk, and essentially tells him his psychological disorder isn't real. It's not a great conclusion. I feel like Marlene really thought she did something here, but she really didn't. Also, the destroyed statue was a fake. Convenient. That particular conclusion was a bit dopey. However, the series overall is actually pretty good. In issue 13, he teams up with Daredevil, who is another one of my favourite Marvel characters. It's a classic fight for a bit and then they're friends type scenario. It's fun. Then, in issue 14, we are introduced to Stained Glass Scarlet, an ex-nun who became a vigilante after being forced to kill her criminal son. She began hunting all of the criminals that ever had a hand in turning her son into a life of crime, and so Moon Knight tries to stop her. However, he ultimately decides to let her escape. This leads to her becoming a recurring Moon Knight character. In issue 16, he has another fun team-up, this time with The Thing. Look at him smoking a big cigar there, right on the cover. You couldn't get away with that these days. And then, to jump forward a bit, issue 25 sees Stained Glass Scarlet return to cause a bit more trouble. However, I specifically want to use this amazing cover to point out how you can already see Sienkiewicz's art getting more interesting and experimental. This is an amazing cover. Then, several issues later, in issues 29 and 30, he teams up with the Werewolf by Night again. It's also worth noting that as this run progresses, our protagonist starts to utilise the Stephen Grant persona more than Mark Spectre. He treats Mark Spectre as the person he was before Moon Knight, back when he used to do not-so-good, ruthless, mercenary-type stuff. Instead, he tries to forget his troubled past by living as Stephen Grant. But speaking of a troubled past, the series concludes with 2 issues telling the secret story of Elias Spectre, Mark's father. Believe it or not, Mark's got some major daddy issues. Also, I know Moon Knight may seem like he's just a few costume alterations away from looking like a clan member, but the character is actually Jewish. His father was a rabbi. And in a pretty powerful scene, Moon Knight actually beats up a bunch of Nazis for burning down a local synagogue. It's dope. The series concludes with some self-acceptance. He is Mark Spectre after all, and he doesn't need to be someone else completely in order to move on from his past. He also somehow comes to terms with his relationship with his recently deceased father, even though the corpse is briefly reanimated and tries to strangle Mark. It's strange, but it is ultimately handled pretty well. Those last few issues were written by Alan Zelnetz, and they helped to pave the way for Moon Knight's next series. Moon Knight got his second solo run a year later in 1985. Zelnetz continued writing, and he was accompanied by Chris Warner on art. In issue 1, Mark is living it up. He lives with Marlene and has been convinced to give up his life of crime fighting, and this also includes forgetting all of his alternative identities. Instead, they have both opted for a life of arts and leisure. He has even set up the Spectre International Art Gallery to sell off some of his possessions, including the statue of Konshu. Yeah, that same one that he used to be obsessed with. However, I'm sure you've noticed the runtime of this video, the story is far from over. Obviously, Mark's new peaceful life doesn't last. When the statue of Konshu falls into the wrong hands, Mark is called back into action by the cult of Konshu, specifically by 3 old priests. Now, the cult of Konshu are exactly what they sound like. They are dedicated to worshipping and serving Konshu. And during this series, they act as the middleman between Konshu and Moon Knight. They regularly give Moon Knight missions, and he is usually given very little choice but to do as he is told. They even present him with a new costume and weaponry. This meant that Moon Knight's new look was updated with a more directly Egyptian-inspired aesthetic. Mark really thought that he could leave his old life behind, but it turns out that Konshu wasn't finished with him yet. And so Moon Knight is back again, kicking ass and having multiple names. In issue 2, we are introduced to Arthur Harrow. Now, Harrow only has this one single comic book appearance so far, so he seems like an odd choice to be the main villain of the Disney Plus series. But to be fair, it seems to be a very different adaptation of the character anyway. In this comic, Dr. Arthur Harrow is a geneticist whose research into the roots and management of physical pain earns him a Nobel Prize nomination. However, before the committee announces the prize's winner, Harrow's colleague Dr. Victoria Greil discovers a terrible secret behind Harrow's research. This run would also redefine Moon Knight's powers as waxing and waning with the phases of the moon. It even takes him a while to get used to his newfound strength. With Mark returning to a life of crime fighting, Marlene decides to leave him. In fact, she even goes back to her ex-husband. She had simply had enough of Mark's violent lifestyle. Which honestly is understandable because there's a lot of death and destruction in these comics, but Moon Knight himself always avoids killing, although his morals are tested several times throughout this run. And in the dark final moments of the last issue, written by Jim Owsley and with art by Mark Beecham, after he has discovered that his new friend has been murdered, we finally see Moon Knight pushed too far, and his no-killing rule goes out the window. By this stage, there has been several remarks made about Mark being schizophrenic. However, that just isn't the case. If anything, that's a misdiagnosis. I enjoy and recommend these comics, but if you're looking for a good story that focuses on his mental health, or his DID, then that won't happen till much later on. The modern Moon Knight comics are much better at handling that kind of subject matter. But in the meantime, we've only reached the late 80s, so let's keep going. We next see Moon Knight in West Coast Avengers Issue 21, which was written by Steve Englehart and featured art by Al Milgrom. After returning to America, Moon Knight had the clearest and most specific vision from Konshu yet. It seemed the West Coast Avengers had travelled back in time to ancient Egypt and taken refuge from the pharaoh Rama-Tut in the temple of Konshu. And so, Moon Knight travelled out to California and the Avengers compound, where he met Dr. Pym and Firebird. After borrowing a spare time machine from the Fantastic Four, Moon Knight, Dr. Pym and Firebird found the West Coast Avengers in the 2900s BC. To his shock, Moon Knight met the same 3 priests in the Temple of Eternity that would meet him 5,000 years in the future, seemingly immortal under Konshu's power. He also learned that the ancient ceremonial weapons that they provided him with when he reclaimed the role of Moon Knight, remember, had been forged by Hawkeye himself in order to help the rebellion of Konshu's followers against Rama-Tut. So there's a random and interesting retcon. Anyway, he ended up joining the team for about 20 issues, and during that time he began dating fellow teammate Tigra. Does this make him a furry? I'll let you decide. Later that year saw the release of Solo Avengers Issue 3, which isn't a particularly notable issue, but it does feature this panel, which was edited into this meme, which went quite viral. You might have seen it. There was no Dracula, no owed money, and instead this was Mooney on the trail of a man known as the Shroud. It's pretty funny, but yeah, it isn't real. During this time, Mark hasn't been using his alters. However, we do get a glimpse of his inner turmoil in West Coast Avengers issue 29, when Mark has a brief conversation with Stephen Grant and Jake Lockley, in his head. It turns out that Mark has been struggling to keep them down, and they have been struggling to get out. Meanwhile, in this same issue, he also hears Konshu encouraging him as he continues to hunt down a criminal called Van Lunt. Mark wants to ignore and deny the voices of his alters, but this then makes him question whether the voice of Konshu is actually real. His relentless pursuit of Lunt leads to a battle in the sky as Lunt attempts to escape by plane. However, Moon Knight causes the plane to spiral out of control, leading it to crash land and kill Lunt. So yeah, Moon Knight has essentially killed another dude. Yeah, it was a criminal, but this still leads to a ripple amongst the West Coast Avengers' morals. Surely an Avenger doesn't kill, right? In the following issue, Moon Knight once again pushes down his alters as he battles the deadly Examiner. But Konshu steps in once again and seemingly gives him a power boost, which helps Moon Knight to defeat his foe. In issue 31, Konshu speaks with Moon Knight again, and this time it's more candid than ever. Up until this point, they haven't really had conversations. It's mainly just been Konshu giving out demands. But now, Mark is hearing Konshu's voice more clearly than ever. Something has changed. His next few appearances almost seem to hint that Konshu is becoming a new dominant alter. Anyway, let's jump ahead to issue 41, and Damon Hellstrom is basically helping the West Coast Avengers to exorcise demons. However, when he releases two dangerous spirits, he needs another one to defeat them. And so, he turns his exorcism powers onto Moon Knight, and releases the spirit of Konshu from him. Yeah, it turns out that the reason for Konshu's newfound chattiness with Moon Knight was that Konshu had slowly been possessing Moon Knight and taking over his mind. And I'm sure you'll agree that is not cool. I mean, the story's kind of cool, but not cool of Konshu to do that. Not cool, Konshu. It turns out that it wasn't even Moon Knight's idea to join the West Coast Avengers. That was Konshu. Up until this point, most of Konshu's interactions have all been in Mark's head, so this was a big departure from the norm. Anyway, Konshu was now satisfied, and so Moon Knight's free will was once again restored. But not before reiterating that the job is not done. Mark must continue to avenge in Konshu's name. Before he disappears, Konshu has this to say.
Gods are selfish, jealous beings. I appropriated your flesh and mind to experience that which I had never experienced. The benefit was mine, the price paid was yours. I now leave this plane to battle the usurper Seth, for we are of the same pantheon, and perhaps I will not survive the coming conflict. But though I perish, let the mortal fist outlive the immortal deity. Strike in my name, disciple. Now and forever, strike in my name.
The god was once again distancing himself from the man. However, he was also saying that his work will never be over. These recent revelations led to Moon Knight quitting the team. As Mark puts it, he met his maker and he's not sure that he liked what he saw. It was time for a fresh start, and that meant parting ways with Tigra as well. Moon Knight left the West Coast Avengers in issue 41. These next two series are quite hard to come by, so you may notice that the scans I use are not quite as high quality as the previous books. For some reason, only 4 issues of this next series are officially available digitally. But I want to finish off talking about the classic era of Moon Knight, and so although these series aren't exactly necessary, I'm still going to talk about them anyway. His next solo series was called Mark Spectre Moon Knight, and it began in 1989. Initially written by Charles Dixon and featuring art by Sal Velluto. In this series, Mark Spectre returns to his old mansion in New York City to pick up where he left off. However, it isn't long before Bushman tracks him down and kidnaps his old flame Marlene. Classic Moon Knight stuff really. Later, in issue 4, Jeff Wilde is introduced. Wilde is the son of Midnight Man. Remember him? And at first, he is out for revenge. However, he has a change of heart and decides to rehabilitate himself and make up for his father's crimes by working alongside Moon Knight. And so, he becomes Midnight, Moon Knight's new sidekick. In issues 19 to 21, Midnight's impulsive nature got him in over his head when dealing with the Secret Empire. This led Moon Knight, Spider-Man and the Punisher into a conflict to bail him out. During the struggle, the Secret Empire shot Midnight, seemingly killing him in front of Moon Knight. Mooney believed his sidekick was dead, but in fact, the Secret Empire took Midnight away to be rebuilt as a cyborg. And he is not happy about being left to the Secret Empire. The next time that we see him is in Amazing Spider-Man issues 353 to 358, which was a big crossover story featuring Moon Knight, Spider-Man, Darkhawk, the Punisher, Nova, and Night Thrasher. In the final conflict, Midnight went mad and suicidal, bringing down a warehouse with his force blasts. Moon Knight was unable to do anything to reach his former partner, and the heroes barely escaped the building collapse. In the aftermath, Midnight's severed cybernetic arm was recovered from the wreckage, and he was presumed dead. This whole story was like a wild 90s version of The Winter Soldier or Red Hood, and it was published before either of those stories. I think Midnight was pretty neat. I haven't mentioned Frenchie too much, but he is Mark's oldest friend, and has been a very consistent ally in Moon Knight's crusade against crime. He's also one heck of a pilot. So, honestly, it's a real shame when he is caught in a series of firebombs set at Spectre Mansion by Moon Knight's brother, Randall Spectre. Yeah, remember him? Well, turns out that other guy wasn't really Randall. It was actually a man who had been brainwashed into thinking that he was Randall. But meanwhile, the real Randall had been watching Mark from the shadows the whole time. As a result of his injuries, Frenchie lost the ability to walk and was confined to a wheelchair. Randall, meanwhile, was executed by the Punisher. The rest of the series sees Moon Knight get some armour, sees him face off against Dr. Doom, he offers Peter Parker to be his replacement as the Avatar of Konshu, and after the Avengers confront him because of his recklessness, he ends up burning his Avengers membership card. A lot of this run is fun, but in my opinion it goes wildly off the rails in the latter half. As I'm sure you can tell, Mark hasn't been using his other personas during this series, hence why it's Mark Spectre Moon Knight and not any of the alters. Like I had previously said, Mark still isn't really being treated like he has any sort of mental illness. But we will circle back to that in the modern era. In the last issue of Mark Spectre Moon Knight in 1994, Moon Knight dies in an explosion, sacrificing himself to save his loved ones. Although by this stage I was struggling to keep reading. I'm really not a fan of Stephen Platt's art. Next up, in 1998, we got a 4-issue miniseries, which saw original creator Doug Moench return to write Mark Spector's resurrection. Because of course, Konshu isn't finished with him yet. This series also brought back Mark's alters, Stephen Grant and Jake Lockley. It also brought back everyone questioning Mark's mental health. Questioning everything, in fact. The previous series had went through a whole bunch of writers and it felt kind of directionless, but this miniseries set Moon Knight back on a path that kind of just ignored most of the 90s. It basically reset the status quo and returned to Moon Knight the characteristics that made him so unique and interesting in the first place. Or at least, that's my opinion. I also think that that's a pretty good place to wrap up this video, because that is pretty much everything you'll ever need to know, and more, about the classic era of Moon Knight. As you've heard, it's kind of a mixed bag. However, without this mixed, directionless bag, then we wouldn't have the modern era of Moon Knight. And I actually think that the modern era of Moon Knight is even better than the classic era. Modern and classic are kind of arbitrary terms, but the way I see it, the classic era is the 20th century and the modern era is the 21st century. I've really enjoyed making this video, but it has been challenging. I'm pretty sure I've read more Moon Knight comics now than any mortal man should. So, if you've appreciated it, then please like this video, share it with your friends, and like the Facebook page or subscribe to the YouTube channel for more geeky good stuff just like this.
Konshu demands it.
And of course, stay tuned for part 2, the modern era of Moon Knight.